in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, pronouns she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm really excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Dr. Ayanna Cummings. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Compass Group National Accounts, and she's an author as well. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yes, well, thank you, Christina. I am Ayanna Cummings. I'm Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice with Compass Group National Accounts. I also have a consultancy, Tapestry Consulting, and a mobile app called Mosaic Synergies, which is a limited liability company as well here in the state of Georgia. I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, attended the Atlanta Public Schools, graduated from Hampton University as an undergrad, and then went on to get a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. I also got a Master of Science and a Master of Philosophy en route to that degree. I then transitioned to the Clark Atlanta University Business School, where I obtained the Master of Business Administration. And during my matriculation to complete the actual dissertation, I got a Master of Education. So I am I'm an advocate for education and empowerment through education. So that is a little bit about my educational background. I also am a cellist. I've played the cello since I was 7 years old and have two beloved Cocker Spaniels, Zuri and Omari.
I love it. I love that you are an advocate for empowerment, education. You have so much experience. And when I was preparing for this interview, I was reading your bio, and I wanted to ask you what really motivates you to do this work and eradicate these big issues in society, such as racism, ageism, heterosexism, and more.
Well, there's a quote from Michelle Obama that I'm going to be using as a part of a chapter that I'm writing for another book about the experiences of Black women DE&I workers in the predominantly white spaces. And she talks about how we can't go out here and solve all of the world's problems all at once in a given day. But we wake up with that forefront in our mind that we're going to go out and actually eradicate racism, the diseases of sexism and heterosexism and ableism and all of those malignant things that plague our society and our systems and our people. And what motivates me is probably the passion that was instilled in me by my parents, where my father didn't rest until he was on a board that tackled economic empowerment issues for underprivileged and underserved communities, or my mother being a judge and chief judge at the largest court of general jurisdiction here in Atlanta, where she had to actually come face to face with people in the criminal justice system and try to motivate them to do different things with their lives than they had done. And in that process of reformation, reifying her commitment to seeing economic and social and educational empowerment for African Americans in particular, growing up in the southwest part of the city of Atlanta, an urban area that oftentimes you turn on the news and see has been wrought with violence and things like that. And when you talk about being from Southwest Atlanta to people who are not from the city of Atlanta, all they know about the part of town that you're from is negative things. But knowing where you come from and knowing the people that you were engaged with as a community when you were a child, you recognize the affluence, the educational empowerment, the advancement, the progression, the fact that Ambassador Andrew Young lives in the same part of town, or Congressman John Lewis lived in that area, and so you have a different conceptualization of who you are and what you're capable of than what other people would consider you to have when you're from a certain part of town and so forth. So knowing all of those things about my background, that duality, growing up in an upper middle class environment, but still being from the SWATs per se, and having to know that right up the street, there's somebody who's suffering and needs support and nourishment and empowerment. And then knowing that it's my responsibility to give back to those communities that I'm from in a way that is meaningful and impactful inspires me each and every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your kind of experience and also the perspective of community lens as well for why you're doing this work. And I want to definitely ask your opinion in terms of how we can really bring these practices into our day to day lives, no matter what role you sit in the organization you're at. And I think a good kind of starting point for there is around managers who are interacting with folks on a day to day basis. And we know that people managers are expected to be more empathetic than ever. They're expected to have these hard conversations as well. And I want to ask, in your opinion, how we can really train effective people managers and really measure their effectiveness there.
Well, number one, the fact that you're engaging in a learning and development practice gives you tools for the dialogue that you're preparing to have. It gives you information that you can use that stimulates your curiosities to have more dialogue and to learn more. But I think some of the more effective training strategies involve immersion, they involve simulation, they involve real world experiences that require you to put practice to what you're learning in a capacity that allows you a safe space, that you're not going to be harmed if you mess up and make a mistake in that environment. And I think the literature on these types of trainings demonstrates that that is the most effective among them, not just informational giving, cognitive based trainings, but also immersion and simulation to amplify the experiences so that people actually can say they've interacted with someone from a different culture. They've had to give critical feedback to someone who was of a different background than their own, and so forth. And I think when we are capable of actually doing those things, we're better able to measure effectiveness in the paradigmatic way of saying, you know, the training was effective at mitigating bias in the long run, not just a month from the training, but also 2 years down the road, that mitigation is still taking place.
Absolutely. It is a long term kind of strategy there. Well, and you want to look at it from a holistic perspective, not a check the box of we did this training, people gave this feedback, so we're done. It's definitely an ongoing process there. The other piece that we had discussed as well in terms of leadership are executive leaders too. And something that we definitely wanted to discuss in kind of the pre call was this feedback in the executive minority leadership paradigm. How must we shift this paradigm to ensure feedback is really effective and constructive and not lackluster or hypercritical of folks in this position?
Well, I think of three things when I think of feedback that actually gets you to a place where you can grow from it. And that is specific, number one, about what in particular you need to do better. It is giving given by way of justification. You are able to amplify the feedback with suggestions from previous experience of interactions with that person or some work product to actually point to and justify why that feedback is being given. And furthermore, it's constructive. It doesn't just give the negative or the critical aspect of the feedback, but it also gives a suggestion on how to reframe whatever it is that the mistake was into a positive learning experience so that the person can do things differently the next time. And without those three things, I think feedback that is hypercritical can be very deflating for us, particularly when we're the only one of a particular ethnicity or race in an environment that is predominated by whites and white males. And so when we want to advance in our careers, we do want constructive suggestions on how to improve, but it's the way that those suggestions are framed. And I'm not talking about necessarily a sandwich approach because I don't think that's the answer here.
Right.
I do think that we can give negative feedback while being constructive and saying what should be done instead.
Absolutely. It's not helpful for anyone just to receive feedback that's all positive, but you also don't want feedback that's over indexed on being negative and it's not helpful. You want it to be very specific, understanding the examples you're providing and how to reframe that. I do want to ask you around an example of feedback that is effective, that is not hypercritical versus feedback that is kind of meaningless and has some underlying tones there.
Mhm. So I think of meaningless feedback, things like talking about the tone of someone's voice or someone appearing to be tense or overly professional. When people point to the fact that Black women can be very aggressive, or in tone be very direct and that kind of thing. That's not helpful, because in most other instances, a man, particularly a white man, would be viewed in a positive way with those same mannerisms and styles. So I don't think a style approach is the right answer to giving feedback to a person who is seeking to advance in their careers, particularly minoritized individuals. Helpful feedback would be more approaching the situation by saying, why don't you jot down 3 or 4 funny or engaging or likable things that you want to engage with other people about? Let's say it is talking about your dogs. It's talking about a hobby you may have. It's talking about a sport that you play, to find commonality with other people so that you become a more approachable person, but without saying something like you appear to be overly tense or you're so professional that you're not approachable and that kind of thing. So I think to reframe that, giving that person a pointer as to how to connect with people in a networking environment, for example, and saying something along the lines of, right now you're elevator pitch by way of bullet points that point to things that you're going to use to find commonality with other people in that environment, would be more helpful.
Absolutely. You're offering something in that situation as opposed to providing just like an observation or how you personally feel as an individual as well, because the intention for both is that you want to help this person and also just have a conversation too, and not kind of give feedback just for the sake of saying something as well. You want it to mean something. Something
Right.
else. Yeah, something else that we also discussed too is around avoiding the quote unquote sticky floor, which I think we're seeing a lot of people
Yes.
having as well. We know internal mobility is important, and also recruitment externally for leadership roles. What is your advice for companies creating executive and manager kind of underrepresented historically pipelines?
Well, this goes to one of your other questions also, Christina, where you asked what's missing from other frameworks and approaches to DE&I in corporations. And it has to do with how comprehensive the program really is. If we're creating a manager in training program, are we creating opportunities that advance not only external candidates who are underrepresented, but also internal candidates who may be frontline associates who want to elevate their careers? I was just watching something on the news, I believe, where Amazon is now going to start in 2022 paying full tuition for all of its workers to attend college if they're frontline associates. And that's one example of how an internal development opportunity can be leveraged in addition to those external facing opportunities that invite others from outside of the organization to come in as interns. And so I think a comprehensive strategy would do both the internal facing and external facing components of that strategy.
Yeah, and you have to invest in the people that are at your company right now and not forget about them, and providing those pathways for growth, internal mobility, upscaling. Education is so important as well. And I think something that, in terms of giving and receiving feedback and making sure your strategy is holistic, is really understanding where you are as an organization. And you need to have trust and psychological safety as a foundation to really get that feedback from folks, what they're seeing, how to meet them where they are. Why is it important for companies to really think about creating that psychologically safe workplace today?
Well, again, if you want to see executive underrepresented minorities or minoritized individuals advance in your company, but you're not willing to give them feedback in a safe space that allows that type of dialogue and exchange to take place, perhaps not even in a comfortable way. Sometimes just because it's safe doesn't make it comfortable, right? So
Mhm.
you want a space where you are able to speak honestly and freely without harming the individual, without having negative impact, no matter your intention. But you also want to do it in a way that is effective. And I think sometimes we talk about psychological safety and we're talking about free, open expression of ideas, but we forget that sometimes that means having a conversation that's very uncomfortable, you know, and saying things that people don't necessarily want to hear. Like, hey, man, that system is totally outdated. You really need to go and update that system. And one of the things that disables psychological safety is that notion of fear. And when people are not expressing themselves freely, it's because there is some repercussion that they're trying to avoid, like being fired or being demoted or not receiving the recognition that they wanted to get, not getting the bonus, or whatever it is. And so we have to remove that fear by creating a space that's not only psychologically safe, but actually really safe, so that they don't have any repercussions or consequences that are retaliatory as a result of their expression of something that is not status quo, or maybe considered taboo, like telling people that their outputs, their systems and processes are not effective.
Absolutely. And that doesn't just happen. They're intentionally built spaces and processes that are psychologically safe, but also, to your point, too, comfortable, that people actually use them, that they feel like they can speak up without being retaliated against as well. I think that's really important, not only to recruit, but also to retain talent and leaders and people who are coming into your organization as well. There are a lot of organizations and leaders who are talking more about diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I wanted to know, in your kind of perspective, what are some common mistakes you're seeing companies make, even with the best intentions, but in their equity strategy?
Well, it may seem daunting at first, but I think one of the pitfalls is that idea that it has to be a phased implementation, one at a time approach. And I say that because you could be very sincerely implementing one step at a time in this phased approach, but a blind spot in another area that you neglected as a result of having to implement one step at a time comes through and erodes the entire process. And I believe it's possible to implement multiple phases at once. And I know I get a lot of disagreement from my colleagues in this area about this particular thing. But I say that because you can be effective at getting buy-in from not only the senior and executive leaders, but also from all members of the organization, so that it really is a cultural transformation that impacts each and every member of that organization. And when you have that, you can form committees, work groups, teams, and so forth that implement each phase or prong all at the same time, or at least multiple ones simultaneously, because those blind spots can erode your path if you're doing step-by-step approaches, I believe.
No, I think that definitely makes sense. In order to have a holistic strategy, to have cultural transformation, a lot of people need to be bought in, not just one person or team or leader or committee as well. You need to understand where you are, acknowledge that, and then see all of the different ways that you can lean into this work as well. And it may not be perfect at first, but you need to do something, and progress doesn't, happen overnight, but you need to do something today to make a change. Do you have a call to action for people listening to this podcast who are really interested in being kind of equity driven leaders, no matter where they sit in the organization, and really, wanting to change up the status quo?
Yeah, well, lean in. Go ahead and do the work and start the work, because if we don't do it now, it'll never get done. And there's so much work to do in this space. It'll never end. As soon as you think you're coming to the end of one project, five more will start, because there's so much to do and so many opportunities out there to seize, especially now. And so we have it before us that the work is there to be done. And we just need someone to pick up that ball and say, I'm going to go with it. So, lean on in and get it started, so that you can at least begin to imagine the scope of what your calling is in this space. And I believe mine is a calling. I don't think it's something that I necessarily chose. And so when you imagine the scope and magnitude of that, you can start to create a plan that is effective at executing it.
Absolutely. Lean into this work. There's so much that can be done. So you just need to start somewhere, and you can make a difference no matter where you sit in the organization, to make it more equitable for folks, to make sure that people belong in the company as well, and elevate the voices of others. Dr. Ayanna Cummings, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture.
Thank you, Christina. It's been such a pleasure. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in the employee feedback management as a requirement for the company to succeed on a whole. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.